All right. So would you shut off an AI, an artificial intelligence, who might be conscious? That's the kind of one of the core questions. That's the core question driving this talk, although we'll have to build up to that question. And I'll say that a substantial portion of this material was created in collaboration with my former graduate student, Mara Garza. So we might soon build an artificially intelligent machine, an AI, who deserves rights. And that would be an act of huge moral significance. Now, before continuing, let me emphasize the might. We might soon build an AI who deserves rights. One thing that strikes me as strange in discussing these issues is the confidence people often exhibit, especially on the negative side, among those who dismiss the possibility of AI rights. I can't tell where their confidence comes from. Some people seem to think it's absurd or obviously false that we could ever build a machine with real moral status. There's almost a hostility sometimes to even taking the idea seriously. But we should take the question seriously, even if there are excellent grounds to doubt that a rights-bearing machine could be made out of integrated circuits on silicon wafers. Future technology need not be limited in the same ways that current technology is. Revolutionary change might be on the horizon. Even if you tend to scoff at inflated claims about the possibility of AI, I think you ought to take the question of possible future AI rights very seriously. So the odds might be low. There might be a good case for pessimism about the speed of technological progress. But if there's even a small chance that we could soon be designing AI who deserve rights, that would be so momentous. That would be such a momentous event. It deserves careful consideration in advance. Unlikely catastrophes are worth guarding against. So why do I say catastrophe? Well, let's suppose that we start to make AI with human-like capacities and human-like consciousness and who deserve human-like rights. I'll call such AI human-grade AI. Google or Facebook or MIT or the US Department of Defense or some other corporate, government, or academic body begins to create fully conscious, human-grade artificial intelligence. Now, unless international law is extremely clear and restrictive, which I doubt it will be, those first human-grade AIs, or at least a substantial portion of them, will exist at the will and the command of their creators. This is the possibility imagined over and over again in science fiction, from Isaac Asimov to Star Trek to Westworld. The default state of the law is that our machines are our property to deploy and dispose of as we wish. So also for intelligent machines. By far the most likely scenario is that the first human-grade AIs will be treated as disposable property. But if such AIs really are human-like with human-like intelligence and consciousness and capacity for suffering and all of that, then treating them as disposable property would be the moral equivalent of holding them as slaves. Similarly, deleting them would be the moral equivalent of murder. Government inertia, economic incentives, uncertainty about when and whether we've crossed the threshold for having human-created, truly human-grade entities, a general human propensity toward a lack of foresight, all of these will combine to ensure that the law lags behind. I'd be amazed if the world were fully prepared for the consequences. So let me cut the softening phrases. If we someday create human-grade AI, then we will have created the moral equivalent of humans. We'll have created what ethicists call persons. These persons will very likely be held as slaves and murdered at will. If they aren't too expensive to create, at least after the right discoveries are made, then these disposable slaves might be created in the millions or the billions. So that's the catastrophe. So there is as depicted in Black Mirror, which is a wonderful TV series for thinking about AI ethics, if you guys aren't familiar with it. Right, this human is being instructed on how to make toast. Now, I've heard 4 arguments against the view that it will ever be possible to create AI who are the moral equivalent of humans. So let's kind of go quickly through these arguments. One, I call the objection from psychological difference. According to the objection from psychological difference, any AI that we create would necessarily be psychologically different from us in some way that ensures that it would never deserve moral consideration similar to that of a human being. All future AI, for example, might lack consciousness, and maybe consciousness is necessary for full moral status. Or maybe AI would necessarily lack free will, and free will is necessary for full moral status. Now, given the uncertainty of future technology, it would be very difficult to establish such a conclusion about artificial entities in general. Future AI might involve artificially grown biological or semi-biological systems, chaotic systems, evolved systems, artificial brains, systems that more effectively take advantage of quantum superposition. You know, although there are some arguments, for example, from philosopher John Searle and physicist Roger Penrose, that the types of AI technology that existed near the end of the 20th century could never host consciousness or never have the same kinds of creative freedom that human beings supposedly have. And I'm aware of no plausible arguments that this is a permanent condition of AI research. In fact, both Searle and Penrose explicitly allow that future AI, constructed very different from classical AI, could potentially host consciousness and have creative freedom of thought. So the farthest I think you could go in this direction reasonably is to think that we'll probably never do it. And if we do it, it will be at least several decades in the future. But if that's your line, then we don't really disagree. Soon needn't mean in the next 10 years, right? I'm a parent. 10 years fly by. For an outcome as momentous as the creation of potentially millions of enslaved disposable persons, even a small chance is serious, and even 50 years is soon. Now, according to the objection from duplicability, AI might not deserve much moral concern because they might not have fragile, unique lives of the sort that human beings have. It might be possible to back up an AI before killing it. Or you might create dozens of identical AIs so that if one's killed, it's not a big loss. Whatever can be backed up and duplicated like this isn't precious in the same way that human life is precious, the reasoning goes. So no big deal if it's zapped. So I'll mention 3 problems with this argument. Right? First, it assumes that future AI would not be unique and fragile, that it'll be possible to duplicate it and back it up, but I see no reason to assume that that would be true. Of course, current computer programs can easily be copied and backed up. But maybe future AI with sufficient complexity will have to be slowly grown and trained, like we are. Or it might, like us, be not amenable to scanning and duplicating due to its reliance on fragile processes. Second, even if AI and human beings differ in duplicability and fragility, at best this addresses the question of whether killing AI would be murder. Slavery is an entirely different issue. Maybe Facebook or Exxon or the military would greatly benefit from creating 1,000 identical AI slaves to do various unpleasant tasks. Third, in some cases, duplicability might increase the moral value of an AI's life. Consider an AI en route to a star to found a new colony. It will live 100,000 years on its journey and then divide into 10,000 descendants upon arrival. If moral considerability varies with duplicability at all, we should arguably accord more moral status to this AI. Its death would be arguably more of a tragedy than the death of a single individual person. All right, third objection, the objection from otherness. You might hold that human beings ought to stick together. Humans owe more to humans than they do to any other type of entity due to our shared humanity. Go team human. On this view, even if there were AIs who were similar in all psychological respects to human beings, those AIs would always be them, right? Something other, opposed to humans, and so undeserving of equal moral treatment by us. Consider the idea of circles of concern, right? We owe the greatest obligation to family, less to neighbors, still less to fellow citizens, still less to distant foreigners, maybe nothing outside of the human species. I think a thought experiment shows the noxiousness of this kind of speciesism. Imagine some hypothetical AIs who are outwardly similar to human beings. Maybe they have human-like bodies, but if you were to look inside their heads, you'd find an artificial brain instead of a human brain. Maybe they're integrated into our society so that no one knows, maybe not even the AIs themselves, who is human, who is AI, unless some specific biological tests are run. Stipulate that they're just as conscious as we are, have the same feelings and ideas and plans as we do. We intermarry with them, we adopt them as children, we form teams with them, we form companies with them. It would be, I submit, a cruel moral mistake upon discovering that some friend of yours really is an AI to suddenly demote that friend from full moral status simply on grounds of that friend's lack of common descent from Homo sapiens ancestors. Although it's reasonable to show more moral concern to people who are socially closer to you than to people who are far away, if we allow that fully self-conscious human-grade AIs are possible, then they could, in principle, be as socially close to you as your spouse or your child. And then species membership is and should be wholly irrelevant to their moral status. The fourth and final objection to consider is the objection from existential debt. Suppose that you build a fully human-grade, self-conscious, intelligent robot. It costs you $1,000 to build and $10 per month to maintain. After a couple of years, you decide you'd rather spend that $10 a month on a streaming video subscription. Learning of your plan, the robot complains, "Hey, I'm a being just as worthy of continued existence as you are. You can't just kill me off for the sake of better access to some Disney movies." You then reply, "You ingrate. You owe your very life to me. You should be thankful just for the time I've given you. I owe you nothing. If I choose to spend my money differently, it's my money to spend." Right, so the argument from existential debt, it begins with the idea that artificial intelligence, simply in virtue of being artificial, is made by us and thus owes its existence to us and thus can be terminated or subjugated at our pleasure without moral wrongdoing, as long as its existence overall has been worthwhile. You wouldn't have built that robot if you'd known you'd be on the hook for $10 a month in perpetuity. Its continuation at your pleasure is the very condition of its existence. So when you finally pull the plug, it should consider its life as a whole and feel grateful that you gave it some time upon the earth. We can compare this to one argument that's sometimes given in defense of eating humanely raised meat. The rancher wouldn't have brought the steer or the pig into existence except as meat. As long as its life overall was happy, there's no wrong when it meets the fate that it was born to. Now, I don't know how well that argument works for humanely raised meat. But when applied to human-grade AI, I think the case in question is more like the following. Anna and VJ decide to get pregnant and have a child. Their child lives happily for his first 8 years. On his 9th birthday, Anna and VJ decide they would prefer not to pay any further expenses for the child so they can buy a boat instead. No one can be found to care for the child, so they kill him painlessly. But it's okay, they argue. It's just like the steer and the robot. They wouldn't have had the child, let's suppose, had they known they'd be on the hook for child rearing expenses till the age 18. The child's support at their pleasure was a condition of his existence. Otherwise, Anna and VJ would have remained childless. So he has nothing to resent. I assume you disagree with their perspective on this issue. Right, the decision to have a child carries with it responsibility for the child. It's not a decision to be made lightly and then undone. Although the child, in some sense, owes his existence to Anna and VJ, this isn't a callable debt to be vacated by ending the. Similarly, if we bring into existence a genuinely conscious human-grade AI, fully capable of joy and suffering, with a full human range of practical and theoretical intelligence, with expectations of a future life, we make a moral decision as approximately as significant and irrevocable as the decision to have a child. In fact, we should turn the argument from existential debt on its head. If we create truly human-grade AI, we would owe it more than we owe to human strangers. We would owe it more because we, like parents, would be responsible for its having come into existence and to a substantial extent for its happy or miserable state. If we as a society someday create truly human-grade AI with the same range of conscious states and potentialities as human beings have, then we enslave and we kill it in large numbers, we will, to put it lightly, have been really terrible parents. To put it less lightly, we will have done perhaps the morally worst thing that a society has ever done in the entire history of Earth. So here's a scene from Blade Runner depicting an artificial intelligence who is not grateful to his creator for having been given 4 years. All right. So let's say you agree with me about all this. And you agree with me that if someday we create truly human-grade AI, we should treat it very cautiously with the same respect and care that we treat human children. If we someday create human-grade AI. But here we face a puzzle. How will we know when we've crossed that line? Now I'm going to make a simplifying assumption. I'm going to assume that an AI deserves full moral status if and only if it has conscious experiences like ours. And we could talk about that assumption during the question period if we want. But if we take that assumption, pretty common assumption, I think, in the background, a lot of work on this, then that throws us sharply on the puzzle of consciousness. As you might know, there is currently immense scientific and philosophical debate about the nature of consciousness. Positions held by prominent researchers run the whole gamut from panpsychism, according to which consciousness is all-pervasive, even perhaps in individual fundamental physical particles, all the way from that on one end to very restrictive views on which only human beings are conscious, not even dogs and monkeys are conscious, or at least determinately conscious. Some theorists think that consciousness requires the specific biology of the vertebrate brain. Others think that consciousness can occur even in programmed classical AI systems. Still others think consciousness requires some sort of naturally evolved, environmentally reactive entity, but it doesn't require a brain much like ours. Still others think that the very concept of consciousness is so deeply incoherent and so laden with false presuppositions that we should just forget the whole business. I've read widely in this literature. Philosophy of consciousness has been my primary specialization for 23 years. Although researchers build their fame with bold, positive theories, which they confidently defend, to me it's clear that the most epistemically responsible position concerning theories of consciousness is one of high uncertainty. Maybe someday we'll figure it all out. But as of now, we're quite far from any sort of justifiable scientific consensus, with no realistic near-term or even medium-term hope of resolution. Some theories are very liberal, seeing consciousness everywhere or almost everywhere. Right? Other theories are very conservative, seeing consciousness as a rare and delicate achievement. So here's what's going to happen. We will create more and more sophisticated AI systems. At some point, we will create AI systems that some people think are genuinely conscious and genuinely deserve human-like rights. We're already coming toward that threshold, right? There already is a robot rights movement. There already is a society modeled on the famous society PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, called People for the Ethical Treatment of Reinforcement Learners. These are currently small movements, but as AI gets cuter and more sophisticated, and as chatbots start sounding more and more like normal humans, and as emotional computation improves, right, these movements will gain steam among people who have liberal views of consciousness. At some point, people will start to demand serious rights for some AI systems. The AI systems themselves, if they're capable of speech or speech-like outputs, might also demand or seem to demand rights. Let me be clear, this will happen whether or not these systems are actually conscious, right? Even if you're very conservative in your view about what sort of systems would be conscious, you should, I think, acknowledge the likelihood that if technological development continues on its current trajectory, there will eventually be groups of people who assert the need for us to give AI systems human-like moral consideration. And then what we'll need is a good, scientifically justified consensus theory of consciousness to sort it all out, right? To figure out, is this system that says, hey, I'm conscious just like you, really conscious just like you? Or is it instead some empty algorithm no more conscious than a toaster? Here's my conjecture. We will face this social problem before we succeed in developing a good scientifically justified consensus theory of consciousness, the theory that we need to solve the problem. We will then have machines whose moral status is unclear. Maybe they do deserve rights. Maybe they really are conscious like us, or maybe they don't. We won't know. And then, if we don't know, we'll face quite a terrible dilemma. If we don't give rights to these machines, and if it turns out that the liberals are right and the machines really do deserve rights, then we'll be perpetrating slavery and murder every time we assign a task or delete a program. So it might seem safer, if there's reasonable doubt, to assign rights to machines. But on reflection, this isn't so safe. We want to be able to turn off our machines if we need to. Futurists like Nick Bostrom have emphasized, rightly in my view, the potential risks of letting our superintelligent machines loose into the world. These risks are greatly amplified if we decide too casually that such machines deserve rights and that deleting them would be murder. Giving an entity rights entails sometimes sacrificing other entities' interests for it. Suppose there's a terrible fire. In one room, there are 6 robots who might or might not be conscious. In another room, there are 5 humans who definitely are conscious. You can only save one group. The other group will die. If we give robots who might be conscious equal rights with humans who definitely are conscious, then we ought to go save the 6 robots and let the 5 humans die. If it turns out then that the robots underneath it all are really just toasters, then that's a tragedy. So let's not too casually assign rights to AI. Unless there's some astounding saltation in the science of consciousness, or alternatively, some substantial deceleration in the progress of AI technology, it's likely we'll face this dilemma, right? Either deny robots rights and risk perpetrating a holocaust against them, or give robots rights and risk sacrificing real human beings for the benefit of mere empty machines. Now, this might seem bad enough, but the problem is even worse than I, in my sunny optimism, have so far let on. I've assumed that AI systems are relevant targets of moral concern if they're human grade. That is, if they're like us in their conscious capacities. But the odds of creating only human grade AIs are slim. In addition to the kind of AI we currently have, which I assume doesn't deserve much in the way of rights, there are, I think, 4 broad moral categories into which future AI might fall. And those are animal grade, human grade, superhuman, and divergent. I've only discussed human grade so far, but each of these 4 types raises puzzles. Not only human beings deserve moral consideration, right? So also do dogs and apes and dolphins. Animal protection regulations apply to all vertebrates. Scientists can't even treat frogs and lizards more roughly than necessary. The philosopher John Basil has argued that AI systems with cognitive capacities similar to vertebrates ought to receive similar ethical protections. Just as we shouldn't torture and sacrifice a mouse without excellent reason, so also, according to Basil, we shouldn't abuse and delete animal-grade AI. Basil has proposed that we form committees modeled on animal care and use committees to evaluate cutting-edge AI research to monitor when we might be starting to cross the line of creating entities with vertebrate-like moral status. Now, even if you think that human-grade AI is decades or a century away, it seems reasonable, given the current chaos in consciousness studies, to wonder whether animal-grade consciousness might be around the corner. I myself have no idea if animal-grade AI consciousness is right around the corner, or if it's instead far away in the almost impossible future. And I think you have no idea either. Superhuman AI, as I'm defining it here, is AI who has all of the features of human beings in virtue of which we deserve moral consideration, but who also has some potentially morally important features far in excess of the human, raising the question of whether such AI might deserve more moral consideration than human beings. Now, there aren't a whole lot of philosophers who are simple utilitarians, but let's illustrate the issue using utilitarianism as an example. According to simple utilitarianism, we morally ought to do what maximizes the overall balance of pleasure to suffering in the world. Now, let's suppose we can create AI that's genuinely capable of pleasure and suffering. I don't know what we'll take to do that, but not knowing is part of my point here. So let's just suppose. Now, if we can create such AI, then it might also be possible to create AI that is capable of much, much more pleasure than a human being is capable of. Consider the maximum pleasure you've ever felt in your life over the course of 1 minute. Call that amount of pleasure X. This AI is capable of feeling 1,000,000,000 times more pleasure than X in the space of that same minute. It's a super pleasure machine. Now, if morality demands that we should maximize the amount of pleasure in the world, it would thereby demand, or seem to demand, that we create as many of these super pleasure machines as we possibly can. We ought maybe even immiserate and destroy ourselves to do so if enough AI pleasure is created as a result. Now, even if you don't think pleasure is everything, surely it's something. If someday we could create super pleasure machines, maybe morally we ought to make as many as we can reasonably manage. Think of all the joy that we would be bringing into the world. Or is there something too weird about that? Now, I've put this point in terms of pleasure. But whatever the source of value in human life is, whatever it is that makes us so awesomely special that we deserve the highest level of moral consideration, whatever it is, unless maybe we go theological and appeal to our status as God's creations or something like that, whatever it is, it seems possible that in principle, we could create that same thing in machines in much larger quantities. We love our rationality, our freedom, our individuality, our independence, our ability to value things, our ability to participate in moral communities, our capacities for love and respect. There are lots of wonderful things about us. What if we were to design machines that somehow had a lot more of those things than we ourselves do? We humans might not be the pinnacle. And if not, should we bow out, allowing our interests and maybe our whole species to be sacrificed for something greater? As much as I love humanity, under certain conditions, I'm inclined to think the answer should probably be yes. Not sure what those conditions are. Finally, consider what I'm calling divergent AI. This is maybe the most puzzling case and the most likely. Divergent AI would have human or superhuman levels of some features that we tend to regard as important to moral status, but subhuman levels of other features that we tend to regard as important to moral status. For example, it might be possible to design AI with immense theoretical and practical intelligence, but with no capacity for genuine joy or suffering. Such AI might have conscious experiences with little or no emotional valence. So just as we can consciously think to ourselves without much emotional valence, there's a mountain over there and a river over there, or the best way to grandma's house during rush hour is to go down Maple Street. So also the Divergent AI could have conscious thoughts like that, but it would never feel, wow, yippee! And it would never feel crushingly disappointed. It would never feel bored. It would never feel depressed. It isn't clear what the moral status of such an entity would be. On some moral theories, it would deserve human-grade rights. On other theories, it might not matter much how we treat it. Or consider the converse, a super pleasure machine, but one with little or no capacity for rational thought. It's like one giant irrational orgasm all day long. Would it be great to make such things and terrible to destroy them? Or is irrational pleasure not really worth so much in the moral calculus? Or consider a third kind of divergence, what I've elsewhere called fission-fusion monsters. A fission-fusion monster is an entity that can divide and merge at will. It starts perhaps as basically a human-grade AI, but when it wants, it can split into 6 or 100 or 1,000,000. These descendants then each inherit all of the capacities, memories, plans, and preferences of the original AI system. These descendants can then go about their business, doing their independent things for a while, and then if they want, merge back together into a unified whole, remembering what each individual did during its period of individuality. Other parts might not merge back, but choose instead to remain as independent individuals, perhaps eventually coming to feel independent enough from the original to see the prospect of merging as being something akin to death. Without getting too much into details here, a fission-fusion monster would risk breaking our concept of individual rights, right? Such as one person, one vote, right? So if you have a monster that one day is one person, and then on the next day is 1,000, and the next day is 12, right? How many votes does it get? Right? This becomes a big problem. How many cookies would you give it from the dole, right? So much of our moral thinking is grounded in the idea of people as individuals, right? Individuals who live in a single body for a while and then die with no prospect of splitting or merging. This whole concept of individual rights, which is so foundational to a lot of ethical thinking, would have to be completely rethought if we shared the planet with entities for whom this model of individuality is radically false. All right, I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to offer some policy suggestions. So first idea here is that human-grade AI might come soon, or it might come a long time in the future, or it might never come. We currently don't know enough about AI and the science of consciousness to justifiably defend a consensus guess. Second, if human-grade AI does come, it will deserve human-like rights. Arguments against giving it such rights all fail. In fact, we will owe it a special duty of parent-like care because we will have been its creators. Third, it's likely that we will create AI that some people think deserve human-like rights before we can justifiably assess whether it does in fact deserve such rights. We will then face a choice between possibly giving it too little moral status or too much moral status. And either of these possibilities is a moral disaster. Fourth, this situation is further complicated by the possibility of animal-grade AI that deserves animal-grade rights, superhuman AI that might deserve superhuman rights, and divergent AI that doesn't fit into our usual framework for rights and moral status. And the animal case, in particular, might be in our near future, adding some urgency to figuring these things out. All right, so some policy suggestions. First, we should prioritize consciousness research. Although I don't hope for a definitive resolution to debates about consciousness anytime in the near to medium term future, the more progress that we can make in consciousness science, the better we can understand the structure of the possibility space. Second, in other work, Mara Garza and I have defended what we call the design policy of the excluded middle. Right, this expands on a suggestion by computer scientist Joanna Bryson. The idea here is to avoid creating entities whose moral status is ambiguous or unclear. If we create entities whose moral status is unclear, then we create the dilemma that I discussed earlier about possibly either over-attributing or under-attributing rights. So what we should do is either, as Bryson suggests, only create AIs who are simple enough that we know that they don't deserve rights. Or alternatively, we should go all the way and create AI systems that clearly are fully equal with us and which we treat accordingly. So it's the unclear cases in the middle that create the worst ethical problems. And third, we should create a framework for evaluating the potential moral status of future AI. Right, this is a suggestion of philosopher John Basil. Now, I'm reluctant to create extra layers of bureaucracy modeled on institutional review boards and animal care and use committees, but I do think that at some point, panels need to be formed that attempt to assess whether and when AI systems would start to be entering the gray zone for having moral status based on our best understanding of the science. There are engineers who would love to and who think they soon will be able to create genuinely conscious machines. If they succeed, or even credibly claim to succeed, there should be some framework in place to evaluate their results and make some ethical determination about the appropriate societal response and regulations. All right, thank you. That's my talk.
Thanks, Eric, for this very thought-provoking talk. I'm going to stop recording so that we can have a discussion